Hey everyone, my name is Arnie and I am part of 10 Chapters Audiobooks. We thought that we would try something different. We thought that it would be interesting and perhaps preferred by many that we do actually a more in-person reading session. So what we will start to do now, in addition to the normal way that we also publish Miles Harrington books and other books as well, is that I will be reading the story for you with my own words, sitting here reading from chapter 1 to chapter 10. So we have a new story now to share with all of you, a new Miles Harrington murder mystery that is called The White Rose Confessions. And it is about a serial killer in Baltimore that Miles Harrington is called to support in the investigation. And what I will do is I will try to do this in one take. So I may be stumbling a little bit with some words here and there, but please just bear with me. And I hope that you enjoy this a little bit different way of reading new stories. And also we'll do the same thing with the older stories in a more personable way. So let's get right into it. Now, so this is a new Miles Harrington story called The White Rose Confessions. Chapter 1, A Summons to Baltimore. Miles Harrington gazed at the blur of telephone poles and industrial outskirts whizzing by as the Amtrak train rattled southward from New York. A few months had slipped past since he closed the Philadelphia murder case, and he spent those weeks quietly back in Manhattan, savoring tentative yet encouraging progress with his father and sister Irene. They shared a few dinners, talked through old wounds, and for once, life had granted Miles a semblance of peace. But if experience had taught him anything, it was that peace rarely lingered. Detective Josephine Carter's call the night before had brought urgency back into his life. A cluster of murders in Baltimore, each bearing a single white rose and a cryptic message. The local police were stumped. They needed outside help. And while part of Miles longed to focus on the fragile family ties it only just began to mend, he couldn't refuse a plea that hinted at a methodical killer on the loose. He arrived at Baltimore's Penn Station under a blanket of sullen gray clouds. The 1990s modernization showed in the bustle of new shops, travelers wielding early model cell phones, and heard announcements echoing in the vaulted ceilings. Outside, a tall woman with a clean, no nonsense bob of a dark hair stood beside an unmarked sedan. She wore a serviceable navy blazer, a gold badge on her belt, and carried herself with a calm intensity that reminded Miles of a coiled spring. "You must be Harrington," she said, extending a firm handshake. "Detective Josephine Carter." "Miles," he replied simply. A drizzle of rain speckled his jacket as they climbed into the sedan. "Thank you for calling me in." "We can use all the help we can get," Carter said, turning the key in the ignition. "3 homicides in 6 weeks, all unsolved. The public's getting panicky. The brass is breathing down our necks. And the only tangible lead is a white rose placed with each victim, plus a weird quote scrawled nearby in permanent marker." Miles nodded, recalling the details she'd outlined briefly on the phone. "Any connection among the victims yet?" "That's the strangest part. Each victim is from a different walk of life. We have an accountant, a college student, and just last week, Annabelle Larkin, daughter of Edward Larkin, who practically owns half the shipping business along the eastern seaboard." She paused, then shot him a glance. "Annabelle's murder is what pushed us over the edge. Larkin's got friends in high places. The department's under pressure." As they pulled away from the station, city blocks of red brick row houses and shuttered storefronts gave way to the redeveloped inner harbor area. Glimpses of blue-gray water appeared between tall office buildings. Carter navigated through traffic with a single-minded focus of a detective used to pursuing leads. "Before we go to the station, there's someone you need to meet," she said. Miles raised an eyebrow. "Another detective?" Carter pressed her lips tight. "A reporter. She's been sniffing around the department for weeks. Name's Cynthia Marshall, Baltimore Tribune. She's convinced there's a bigger story behind these murders. Some conspiracy tied to Larking Marine Logistics. She demanded an interview with you specifically." Miles sighed. The press attention in Philadelphia had been relentless. "And you want me to cooperate?" "Up to you," Carter said, pulling into the curb beside a small coffee shop. "But if we stonewall her, she'll spin her own version anyway. Might be better to keep her somewhat in the loop." Inside, a woman stood at a corner table, scanning the door with hawk-like intensity. She had chin-length auburn hair, a reporter's notebook, and half a smile that suggested she'd known the moment they arrived. She wore a burgundy blazer, professional yet striking. The instant she spotted Miles, she tapped a pen against her notepad in acknowledgement. "You're Miles Harrington?" she said, her voice friendly but probing. "Cynthia Marshall, I've been following your work since those cases in New York, especially the recent one in Philadelphia. Quite the reputation you built." Miles forced a polite smile. "If that's a compliment, thank you, but we're pressed for time." Cynthia's smile only widened. "I'll be quick. Do you believe we have a serial killer here in Baltimore?" She flipped to a page filled with handwritten notes. "Rumor is the victims share a tie to Larking Marine Logistics. Truth or rumor?" He exchanged a glance with Carter. "I'm not at liberty to discuss an active investigation in detail. But if I find anything that could help the public remain safe, you'll know." Cynthia purged forward. "Fair enough. But if you want a real lead, you should know of uncovered evidence of hush money payments from Larking's company to various individuals. Could be unrelated, or it could be exactly the thread you need to pull." Miles said nothing at first, though he felt Carter stiffen beside him. They both recognized the significance of any rumor linking at a shipping magnate's dirty dealings with a murder spree. That was big, possibly bigger than Cynthia realized. "Well," Miles finally said, "if you come across credible information, pass it on. In the meantime, maybe step carefully. This killer isn't playing around." Cynthia smiled, a dangerous gleam in her eyes. "I wouldn't expect them to." They parted ways, with Carter leading Miles back to the sedan. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the wipers squeaking across the windshield. "Finally," Carter said. "Don't trust her too far. She can be as slippery as any suspect." "Journalists have their own agendas," Miles agreed. "But she might be onto something. Let's see where this goes." He looked out at the harbor waters glinting under the overcast sky. 3 murders in 6 weeks. White roses at each scene. Cryptic messages referencing hidden sins. A city on edge. A wealthy magnate under scrutiny. And now a reporter hinting at conspiracies. It was almost too much for day one. But Miles Harrington had answered the call. Whatever dark path lay ahead, he would follow the clues to the bitter end. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. White Roses and Hidden Wounds. The Baltimore Police Department's homicide bullpen was cramped, fluorescent-lit maze of desks, ringing phones, and disheveled case files. Detective Carter led Miles through it like a guide on a battlefield tour, nodding curtly at half a dozen colleagues who paused at the newcomer. Whispers about the consultant from New York, seemed to rustle through the stale air. "Don't mind them," Carter said, under her breath. "A few are resentful they have to lean on outside help." Miles gave a terse nod. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered skepticism from local detectives. He took no offense, so long as the friction didn't impede the case. They reached a desk piled with manila folders, coffee-stained memos, and a battered corkboard pinned with crime scene photos. "This is us," Carter said simply, gesturing to two chairs. "Let's get you up to speed." They started with the earliest case, Margaret Dyer, a junior accountant at a mid-level financial firm. She was found by a jogger early one morning, sprawled near an abandoned shipyard, a single white rose on her chest. Next to her body, in black marker, someone had scrawled on the concrete, "The truth can't stay buried." Investigators found no signs of robbery or sexual assault. Dyer had no known enemies. Second victim, Jason Kim, a sophomore at a local college, discovered in a dimly lit parking garage. Same cause of death, multiple stab wounds, same white rose, same style of cryptic message. This time it read, "All debts must be paid." The wording suggested personal motives, yet the victims seemed to have no links to each other. Then came the third and most high-profile murder, Annabelle Larkin, 23, who had come home from a late charity event. She never made it inside the family's ornate townhouse. The doorman found her slumped near their front steps, her dress spattered with blood, white rose at her side. On the sandstone wall, scrawled, "Confess and atone." Miles studied the photos. In each, the white rose was placed with precision, as if part of a ritual. He noted the black marker messages were all angled consistently, as though the killer had a practiced approach. "This person's organized, methodical," he murmured. "They're not leaving these messages in a panic." Carter nodded. And the choice of quotes suggests a moralistic or punitive angle, someone who believes they're exposing hidden sins. Miles flipped through the autopsy reports. All three victims died from knife wounds, though each was stabbed in different patterns. No signatures in the actual method, he said. No consistent angle of entry, no identical wound patterns. "Right," Carter replied. "So we're left with the rose and the messages as the primary linkage. Have we found any direct connection among these three? Occupations, personal lives, social circles?" Carter hesitated. "This is where it gets peculiar. We suspected no link until we dug deeper into credit card statements. Each victim had, at some point, a financial transaction involving Larkin Marine Logistics. Margaret Dyer audited shipping accounts for a brief period last year. Jason Kim's father was contracted by Larkin for a shipping container lease. And obviously, Annabelle was part of the Larkin family." Miles tapped his chin thoughtfully. "So Larkin's orbit touches them all, but the significance of each link might vary. For Margaret, it was professional. For Jason, indirect. For Annabelle, direct." "Exactly," Carter said, leaning forward. "So is this some vendetta against the Larkin empire? We've questioned Edward Larkin, but he insists he's as baffled as we are." Miles recalled Cynthia Marshall's insinuations. Cynthia mentioned hush money payments from Larkin Marine. Maybe these victims stumbled on something they shouldn't have had. Fraud, corruption, who knows? And the killer is punishing them for their involvement or silence. Carter exhaled, brushing her hair behind one ear. "Possibly. If that's the case, why target Annabelle? She was the magnate's daughter, not a whistleblower, unless she learned about it and threatened to come forward." They fell silent for a moment. The sound of the overhead lights seemed louder than before. Miles' thoughts drifted momentarily to his father and Irene, wishing he could draw on their perspectives. But this was far removed from his family affairs in New York. He pushed the thought aside. Where do we stand on forensics? Any DNA, footprints, fiber evidence? Carter handed him another folder. So far, no solid matches. We do have partial prints at the Jason Kim scene, but they weren't conclusive. Our lab is old school, underfunded. We're still waiting on updates. Miles set the file down. Let's revisit the crime scenes, see them with fresh eyes. Maybe I'll spot something the initial investigators missed. Carter nodded. We can start with the dockyard, where Margaret Dyer was found. But be warned, it's mostly abandoned, easy for someone to slip in and out unnoticed. Miles rose from the chair, a surge of adrenaline coursing through him. Then let's not waste time. They made their way to the exit, passing a row of desks where uniformed officers typed up reports. A muffled TV on a corner desk played a local news segment recapping the murders. The anchor's tone was grave, stirring more public fear. As Miles stepped outside into the damp Baltimore air, he felt the weight of the city's unease bearing down on him. 3 murders, all pointing to Larking Marine in some way, cryptic moralistic messages, and a methodical killer still at large. He hoped the next few hours would illuminate a path, but a nagging voice told him the killer might be 2 steps ahead, carefully orchestrating each crime to lure investigators into a labyrinth of half-truths. If that were the case, the real question wasn't just who was killing, but why they wanted these particular victims to die, and who might be next. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. At the Edge of Water. The late afternoon sun dipped low as Miles and Carter arrived at the old dockyard. Rusted chain link fencing surrounded a cluster of battered warehouses long since shuttered by shifting economic tides. Weeds sprouted from cracks in the concrete, and the water lapped gently against barnacle-encrusted piers. It was almost peaceful, if one can ignore the fact that Margaret Dyer's body had been discovered mere yards away. Carter parked the sedan near a row of decaying crates, stepping out onto the gravel with a grim look. We've been here multiple times, she said, leaning Miles toward a makeshift memorial of wilted flowers and weathered photos propped against the fence. Neighbors occasionally leave tributes, but no one really lingers after dark. Miles scanned the ground. Which area was taped off for Margaret's murder scene? He asked. Carter pointed to a spot a few yards away, where a faded outline of spray paint remained from the initial evidence markers. That's where her body was found. The white rose was placed over her heart. The message, "The truth can't stay buried," was scrawled on the deck just behind her. She walked a short distance, tapping her foot on a section of weathered wood. It's been scrubbed since, but you can still see faint traces. Miles crouched, running his fingers along the plank. Only the faintest ghost of black lettering remained. No footprints recovered? Just smudges, Carter said. The surface was damp that morning. We got parts of Margaret's shoes, but nothing else. The jogger who found her left footprints, too. It was a mess. He rose, listening to the wind whistle through broken windows above. Did forensics find anything near the fence line? Maybe the killer waited or watched from a vantage point? Carter shook her head. Nada. Like I said, it's an easy place to slip in and out. Nobody around at night. Miles squinted at the high vantage of a warehouse rooftop, imagining a figure looming there, waiting. This scene feels staged. Why here? Margaret Dyer lived across town. So the killer either abducted her or lured her here. That's what we suspect. She left work around 7 in the evening, never made it home. Carter turned at the rumble of a passing truck. Her car was found 3 blocks away, keys on the seat, no sign of a struggle. Miles' mind churned. This killer was calm, methodical, unafraid to transport victims or manipulate their final location. They wanted this area, he said quietly, somewhere symbolic, maybe tied to Larkin's shipping operations. You said Margaret audited accounts for Larkin Marine? Possibly she uncovered something about a dockyard transaction? Carter stared at him, her brow furrowing with renewed conviction. Could be. Let's see if we can speak to her old coworkers or her manager at the accounting firm. They might know if Margaret was investigating anything suspicious. Miles nodded. And we should cross-check with Jason Kim's father's involvement in container leasing. Maybe the same dock was used. A gust of wind swept through, scattering loose debris across the cracked pavement. The city seemed to exhale, as if aware of the dark secrets swirling around it. For a moment, they stood in silence, the hush punctuated only by distant gull cries. Then Carter's pager beeped. She glanced at the tiny screen, her expression tightening. That's the station, she said. They want us back ASAP. Something about a new development. They wasted no time returning to the car. As Carter started the engine, Miles caught sight of a figure standing behind the fence, a slight woman in a burgundy blazer, pen, and a notepad in hand. Cynthia Marshall. He gestured toward her. She's persistent, isn't she? Carter scowled. I'm not sure how she keeps finding us. Rolling down the window, she called out, This is a restricted area, Miss Marshall. Cynthia stepped forward, voice raised just enough to carry. I can read signs, Detective. I'm on public property. Any comment on whether this location is connected to the other murders? Miles noted she asked with feigned innocence. The same cunning glint was in her eyes before. He decided to respond calmly. We're actively investigating all angles, Miss Marshall. I'd advise caution if you plan to wander around alone. Oh, I won't stay long, she said, flashing a determined smile. But I hear whispers that the victims might all have ties to a certain shipping tycoon. Care to verify? Carter's grip on the steering wheel tightened. No comment. Then I guess I keep digging, Cynthia said lightly, flipping her notepad closed. Be careful out there, Miles. She turned and walked off, her footsteps echoing across the empty lot. Carter let out an exasperated sigh. That woman is going to get herself killed. Miles nodded in silent agreement. Something about Cynthia's unrelenting pursuit of a scandal, particularly one involving Edward Larkin, made him uneasy. If she provoked the killer by exposing hidden truths, she could end up with a rose of her own. They pulled away, leaving the deserted docks behind. Under a sky that was fading from gray to a sickly yellow, Miles couldn't shake the feeling that the city itself was holding its breath, bracing for the next strike. The killer was out there, calculating, planning, perhaps savoring every moment the police scrambled in the dark. And so Miles braced himself too, because if the killer continued this pattern, another victim could be lying in wait, connected to Larkin's empire in ways no one had yet deciphered. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. Pressure from all sides. The Baltimore Police Department was in full scramble mode when Carter and Miles returned. Phones rang incessantly. Officers hustled between desks, clutching folders and scribbling notes. A wave of tension swept through the bullpen. The city's anxiety over a potential serial killer had escalated overnight, with local news channels calling him the White Rose Murderer. Carter steered Miles toward a conference room where a cluster of grim-faced detectives pored over a corkboard. Several pinned photographs depicted the victims, the black marker messages, and a city map with color-coded pushpins indicating the last known locations. In one corner, a small photo of Edward Larkin was tacked up, question mark scrawled beside it. Detective Warren, a stocky man with a thick mustache, cleared his throat. We just received an anonymous tip referencing a new location. Something about a rose waiting at the harbor. Dispatch tried to trace the call, but it was from a payphone. Miles frowned. Another stage scene? Warren shrugged. Could be, or it could be a crank. This killer's generating a lot of copycats, rumor mongers, you name it. Carter looked at Miles. Worth checking out. We can't ignore it. Before they could leave, however, the door burst open. In strode a tall, broad-shouldered man with a silver hair and the bearing of someone used to giving orders. Captain Reese. He set his glare on Miles first, then Carter. Detective Carter? He barked. I trust you're making progress. The mayor's on my back about these murders. Carter nodded curtly. We're pursuing several leads, sir. Miles Harrington has been instrumental so far. Reese shifted his gaze to Miles. Harrington? I'm told you have a knack for high-profile cases. Let's hope that's true, because if we don't deliver results soon, the mayor's threatening to bring in external agencies full-time. Miles gave a measured nod. We're getting closer, Captain, but serial killers rarely unravel overnight. Reese's expression was steely, then unraveled faster. He turned on his heel and stormed out, muttering something about press conferences and city council pressure. Carter exhaled the moment the door clicked shut. He's under a ton of stress. This is the biggest case in years. The city's on edge. Warren handed Carter a slip of paper with the details of the anonymous call. Pier 14, near an old fish cannery. The caller claimed there's a white rose and a sign waiting. Miles checked the clock on the wall. 6:13 p.m. Let's move. If it's real, we don't want to be late. An hour later, Carter and Miles stood at Pier 14, a deserted stretch of waterfront flanked by rusting loading cranes. The fish cannery loomed behind them, its broken windows and flaking paint testament to years of abandonment. They flashed their badges at a uniformed officer who was already there, scanning the scene with a flashlight. Nothing yet, the officer said, shining the beam across the old dock. But this place gives me the creeps. Miles stepped carefully over rotten planks, the wooden boards creaking underfoot. He felt the weight of the situation in his chest, a sense that they were about to stumble onto something no one wanted to find. Then he froze, spotting a pale shape at the base of a toppled barrel. It was a white rose, its petals almost luminescent in the faint light. Next to it, a sheet of paper pinned by a rusted nail. Carter eased closer, drawing on a pair of gloves, before gently lifting the page. Scrawled across it in a jagged, bold hand were the words, "You cannot hide your sins forever." Carter's jaw tightened. No body, though. Is this a warning or a decoy? Miles surveyed the shadows. Could be both. The killer might be testing us or wanting to rattle us. Suddenly, a shape flitted in the corner of Miles' vision. He spun, heart hammering, but it was only a stray cat darting between crates. He exhaled and refocused on the note. We need a forensics team to dust for prints. Carter signaled the uniform officer to call it in. We're dealing with someone who thrives on a cat and mouse. They're taunting us. Miles picked up the rose carefully. Its stem was fresh, no sign of wilting. This was placed recently, he said. They heard footsteps behind them, turning. They saw Cynthia Marshall emerging from the gloom, notebook clutched to her chest. Carter stiffened. How on earth did you find us? Cynthia gave a half shrug, her eyes flicking to the rose. I have sources, Detective. And I see you found another calling card. Any comment for the Tribune? Carter bristled. This is an active crime scene. Miles gently interjected. Miss Marshall, your presence here isn't safe. The killer could still be nearby. She shook her head, scribbling notes. I'm willing to take risks. People have a right to know this maniac is escalating. Aren't we facing a bigger pattern? Some link to Larkin's empire? Miles exchanged a glance with Carter. They said nothing, but the tension hung as thick as the briny air. The killer had left another message. No victim this time. A precursor, perhaps, to the next murder. And Cynthia was determined to tie it to Edward Larkin. If she kept it up, her name might soon appear on the killer's list, if it wasn't there already. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. Trails of Corruption. Morning brought a swirl of activity at the station. Forensics from Pier 14 yielded no usable prints on the note or rose, reaffirming how carefully the killer covered their tracks. Detective Carter and Miles holed up in an office with a pot of burnt coffee to review files on Larkin Marine Logistics. The Larkin Empire, Carter began, rubbing the back of her neck, spans commercial shipping, freight forwarding, and a handful of smaller subsidiary companies. Edwin Larkin inherited it from his father in the late 70s and turned it into a powerhouse. Miles sifted through documents on the shipping schedules, corporate structures, and expansions. He paused at a ledger revealing questionable financial transactions, some flagged by an internal accountant last year. This might be how Margaret Dyer got involved, he murmured. She performed a routine audit, stumbled onto something bigger. Cynthia Marshall implied hush money, Carter said, pressing her lips together. But we haven't found direct proof. A knock on the door made them look up. Detective Warren entered, an unlit cigarette clenched between his teeth. Captain wants you to talk to Edwin Larkin again. The man's complaining about harassment from the press and is worried about his personal safety. Warren cracked a mirthless grin. He's demanding answers. Miles nodded. Let's see if we can glean anything new from him. They found Edward Larkin in his plush corner office overlooking the inner harbor, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the water, sleek mahogany furniture, a tastefully modern painting on the wall. Dressed in a tailored suit, he sat behind a gleaming desk, radiating impatience. Detectives, he said, his voice taut. Mr. Harrington. He gestured for them to sit, but didn't rise from his chair. I assume you have progress to report. Carter remained standing. We're still gathering evidence. However, we noted that each murder victim had a link to your company. Larkin's face tightened. I've heard that rumor. It's absurd. My business is huge. Half this city has a link, if you look hard enough. Miles studied Larkin's expression. Were you aware that Margaret Dyer was auditing your accounts for potential fraud last year? Larkin's gaze flickered. I oversee many audits. If there was a red flag, my CFO would handle it. I can't be expected to track every employee's task. His dismissive tone piqued Miles' curiosity. And Jason Kim's father was leasing containers from you. Annabelle, your daughter, was obviously family. If there's someone with a vendetta against your empire, they might be systematically targeting anyone tied to it. A flash of grief crossed Larkin's face at the mention of Annabelle. My daughter was innocent, he said sharply. She had no involvement in any questionable dealings, if that's what you're insinuating. Carter injected, her tone measured. We're not making accusations. We're trying to establish motive. Whoever's committing these murders is leaving messages about hidden sins, debts to be paid, points to a moral crusade or personal vendetta. Larkin leaned back in his chair. steepling his fingers. Detective Carter, Mr. Harrington, I built this company from modest success into an international force. Along the way, I've gathered competitors, enemies, some willing to stoop to sabotage. His eyes narrowed. But to kill my daughter? That's monstrous. I want these killers found, and I want them punished. Miles nodded. We will do our best, Mr. Lockie. In the meantime, it might help if you'd cooperate more fully with the financial side. We need a clearer view of your transactions to see if there's a thread connecting the victims. Fine, Larkin said curtly. Submit a request through my attorneys. He stood up, effectively ending the meeting. And for God's sake, catch this lunatic before more lives are lost. Outside Larkin's office, Carter let out a breath. He's stonewalling. Anything we get through his attorneys will be sanitized. Still, he seems genuinely aggrieved about Annabelle. Miles rubbed his temples. He could be genuinely grieving and also be hiding his own shady deals. Those aren't mutually exclusive. A voice suddenly cut in behind them. Couldn't agree more. They spun around to see Cynthia Marshall leaning casually against the hallway column with her notebook. She flashed a press badge. Got a brief comment from Mr. Larkin earlier. He wasn't exactly friendly. I gather the official line is still that Larkin has no idea you might target him. Care to enlighten me, Detective Carter? Carter's eyes narrowed. Miss Marshall, if you keep popping up like this, you'll find yourself in contempt of something. We can't share sensitive case details. Cynthia shrugged. Then I'll share something with you. I've traced a series of financial payouts from Larkin Marine to shell companies overseas, companies tied to known smugglers. It's circumstantial, but it paints a picture of corruption. Her gaze fixed on Miles. Maybe the killer sees themselves as avenging whatever crimes Larkin's empire has glossed over. Each victim, in some way, might have contributed or turned a blind eye. Miles paused. Cynthia's lead could be crucial, or it could be a red herring. If you have documents, pass them on. Let the police decide if they're valid. She gave a small laugh, as if the notion amused her. I'll consider it, but I won't let my exclusive slip away. Her expression softened. You should know, I received an anonymous call last night. Someone whispered, "Stop looking at Larkin, or you'll get a rose of your own." Then they hung up. She hesitated. It's probably just a crank, right? The flicker of fear in her eyes suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Carter sighed. We'll keep that in mind, and you need to be careful, Miss Marshall. Cynthia offered a grateful nod, then turned to walk away, her heels clicking across the polished floor. Miles watched her go, feeling a pang of unease. If the killer was truly fixated on punishing anyone tied to Larkin's secrets, Cynthia's relentless digging made her an obvious target. And at the rate she was pushing, it might only be a matter of time before the White Rose murderer decided to send her a final warning, one that came with a blade instead of a phone call. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. Another victim, another clue. Night fell over Baltimore in a swirl of neon lights and harbor reflections. Miles found himself alone at a modest hotel near the station, restlessly flipping through notes and autopsy photos spread across the bed. His usual composure wavered. Each victim's face seemed to stare at him accusingly. He mulled over the motivations behind the murders. Someone punishing perceived wrongdoing linked to Larkin Marine, an Avenger, an ex-employee with a vendetta. Just after midnight, his phone rang. It was Carter's voice. Urgent. Miles, get down to Fells Point. We've got another body. He pulled on his coat and hurried outside, hailing a taxi. The streets were nearly empty, the city's nighttime silence shattered only by the distant hum of traffic lights and a stray siren. By the time he arrived at the scene, a narrow cobblestone alley behind a row of waterfront bars, Carter was already there, along with a team of uniformed officers and a forensic tech snapping photos. The victim, a middle-aged man in a rumpled suit, lay on his side, a crimson stain spreading across cobblestones. A white rose perched precariously on his shoulder. Scrawled on the brick wall in black marker was the message: Your guilt devours you. Mills crouched down beside the body, careful not to disturb anything. The man's eyes were still open, frozen in shock or pain. Carter consulted her notes. His ID says Gregory Fuchs, a regional manager at one of Larkin's subsidiary freight companies. Security cameras from a nearby bar show him leaving around 10:30. He was attacked here, likely within the last hour. Multiple stab wounds, same pattern as before. Miles closed his eyes momentarily. Another life snuffed out. Another clue in a twisted puzzle. Fuchs. That name ring any bells? Carter nodded. We found references to him in the Larkin Marine files. He coordinated shipments between East Coast ports. It fits the pattern. All these people tied to the Larkin Empire. As the forensics team did their work, Miles examined the rose. Fresh, likely purchased recently. The killer must have planned this well in advance. A uniformed officer approached with a sealed evidence bag containing a piece of paper. We found this pinned under the victim's jacket. Carter took it, reading aloud. Let the city tremble. The final confession is near. She looked at Miles. We're dealing with a maniac who's escalating. 4 murders and now a 5th. Each one stepping closer to some grand reveal, I suspect. Miles shuddered. The White Rose murder wasn't slowing down. If anything, they were picking up speed. We need to figure out who else might be on their lists. Back at the station, the atmosphere was grim. Captain Reese paced in front of a whiteboard, demanding immediate solutions. Carter and Miles summarized a new murder, each linked to the Larkin Marine, each cryptic message referencing guilt, confession, or hidden sins. So it's definitely a serial killer targeting anyone connected to Larkin's shipping empire, Reese muttered, slamming a fist on the table. We have to warn potential targets, bring Larkin back in, put him under guard, whatever it takes. Miles nodded. We also need to see if Gregory Fuchs had any specific reason to be targeted, recent disputes, questionable shipments, anything that stands out. Reese sighed. We'll do that. Meanwhile, I want you to talk to Larkin and his entire executive team. The city expects results, no more bodies. As dawn broke, Miles stared at the pinkish glow on the horizon, feeling the weight of the night's revelations. Another victim, another rose. The killer's pattern seemed unwavering. Punish those connected to the shipping empire, leaving behind moralistic messages. Where was it all leading? Lost in thought, he nearly missed the figure approaching him in the hallway. Cynthia Marshall, looking paler than usual. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed her own sleepless night. She held a newspaper in her hands, the front page headline screaming, White Rose Killer claims 5th victim. Who's next? I see you've been busy, Miles said quietly. She scoffed. My editor's been hounding me. The city is panicking, and every rumor about Larkin is fueling speculation. She hesitated, then held out a folder. I decided to show you something. These are documents tying Gregory Fuchs to suspicious cargo manifests. shipments he flagged as special deliveries. They might be relevant. Miles took the folder, flipping through typed forms, references to container numbers. Some repeated dates seemed suspicious indeed. Where'd you get this? Her expression hardened. An inside source who's terrified to come forward. They claim those shipments involved contraband, maybe weapons, maybe something else. If Fuchs was part of it, that could be a motive for the killer to label him guilty. Carter, overhearing, approached with a frown. Have you verified this, Miss Marshall? Not fully, Cynthia admitted, but it's consistent with the hush money angle. Miles exchanged a look with Carter. This is big, if true. We'll cross-check it. Keep your source safe, Cynthia. This killer won't stop. She nodded, shoulders tense. I've got to run. Deadline in an hour. She left, leaving Miles and Carter staring after her, mind awhirl with possible connections. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to snap into place, each victim potentially complicit, or at least aware of Larkin Marine's illicit operations. The killer's twisted logic was to punish them one by one, demanding confessions that never came. But if that were the case, who could possibly have such intimate knowledge of these dealings? An employee? A family member? Someone seeking revenge for a wrong the company caused? With every passing hour, the body count grew, leaving an entire city gripped by fear. Miles felt the pressure sink deeper into his bones. Time was running out to halt this spree, and the final confession the killer seemed so eager to force. End of chapter 6. So I hope you're enjoying the story so far. We're getting now deeper into the killer spree of this serial killer in Baltimore, the White Rose Murderer. Let's continue. Chapter 7, A Narrowing Circle. Detective Carter arrived at Miles's makeshift desk, a fresh cup of coffee in each hand. You'll need a caffeine, she said, handing him one. We have a lineup of Larkin executives to interview today. Miles accepted the cup gratefully. Any that stands out as potential suspects? Carter flipped open a notepad. 2, primarily. Oliver Crane, the CFO rumored to handle hush money accounts, and Rosalind Vega, a VP who oversaw freight operations. If Margaret Dyer discovered financial irregularities, she likely reported them to Crane. And if those irregularities involved smuggling or contraband shipments, Vega might have known. Miles sipped the coffee. Let's start with Crane. CFOs are gatekeepers. If someone is using Larkin's resources to kill, or if Crane himself is orchestrating it, he'd have the means to hide a paper trail. They headed downstairs to a drab interrogation room. Oliver Crane was already waiting, impeccably dressed in a three-piece suit, thin, sharp-featured, with hair slicked back. He appeared more like a Wall Street broker than a shipping executive. He offered a dismissive glance as Carter and Miles entered. This is hardly necessary, Crane said, tapping a gold pen on the table. I've already spoken to the police multiple times. The company's under siege, our stock is plunging, and you're turning your suspicions on me? Absurd. Miles sat across from him. We're simply gathering information, Mr. Crane. Multiple victims have ties to Larkin Marine. We want to understand how those ties intersect with corporate finances. Crane pursed his lips. The White Rose killer is targeting anyone associated with us, presumably. That doesn't mean we're behind it. Carter leaned forward. Margaret Dyer was auditing possible fraud in your department. Did she uncover something that put her in danger? Crane bristled. Audits happen all the time. If Miss Dyer found anything serious, she never raised it with me. You're barking up the wrong tree. Miles met Crane's gaze steadily. What about Gregory Fuchs' shipments flagged as special deliveries? We have partial records indicating there might be contraband. Crane's face tightened. That's ridiculous. Fuchs was a manager with limited authority. If there were irregularities, I would know. Carter eyed him. Then you won't mind if we have full access to your accounts? Crane smirked. That's for my legal team to handle. Detective, are we done here? He pressed him further, but Crane stonewalled, falling back on corporate jargon and hints of legal action. After 20 minutes, Carter motioned for him to leave. He collected his briefcase, shot them a glare of haughty indignation, and exited. Miles rubbed his temples. He's either clueless or an excellent liar. Carter shrugged. Maybe both. Let's see if Rosalind Vega is more forthcoming. Rosalind Vega arrived next, stepping into the interrogation room with an air of quiet determination. In her mid-40s, she wore a tailored charcoal skirt suit, her dark hair swept into a bun. Unlike Crane, she didn't bristle with defensiveness. Instead, she exuded a calm sorrow. What do you need to know? She asked quietly. Miles and Carter exchanged a glance. To start, Carter said, did you have direct dealings with Gregory Fuchs or Margaret Dyer? Vega nodded. Yes. Fuchs managed shipments at the ground level. He reported to me about logistic challenges. Margaret handled some of the audits. She reached out once about an odd invoice from a shipping container that never arrived. Miles leaned forward. What became of that inquiry? Vega's gaze dropped to her clasped hands. I forwarded to Mr. Crane, as per protocol. He told me it was a clerical error and not to worry. Did you believe him? Miles asked. She hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. I had my reservations, but Crane has a strong influence on Mr. Larkin, so I didn't push. Carter drummed her fingers on the table. We suspect these irregularities might tie into illegal shipments. Could that be a motive for murder? Vega's eyes widened. I never imagined he would go that far, but I can't deny something felt off. There were discrepancies that never got properly explained. Miles studied her expression. Do you have any idea who might want to systematically kill these people? And Annabelle too? Why target Larkin's daughter if the issue is about corporate malfeasance? Vega swallowed hard. I wish I knew. She was a sweet girl, but rumor had it she was asking questions about some charitable donation that didn't match the books. Maybe she stumbled onto bigger secrets. A silence fell. Carter nodded. Thank you, Miss Vega. If you remember anything else, contact us immediately. And please, be cautious. This killer has a pattern. As Vega left, she paused at the door. I'm scared, she admitted. I'd be lying if I said otherwise. We're all on edge. Miles watched her go. Something about her demeanor suggested genuine concern, not an act. If she was telling the truth, the seeds of conspiracy pointed more and more toward Oliver Crane, or possibly someone overshadowing them all. After the interviews, Carter and Miles stepped outside for a breather. A crisp breeze rustled the flags atop the station building. Miles stared at the bustling streets, cars honking, pedestrians scurrying. Life went on, while a predator lurked in the city, leaving white roses with corpses as twisted symbol of retribution. Carter exhaled. My gut says Crane is hiding something, but we have no hard evidence. Meanwhile, the killer is still out there picking off anyone connected to these shady dealings. Miles nodded grimly. And each murder is more brazen than the last. Time's running out. As they headed back inside, a uniformed officer called out for Carter. Detective, there's a phone call. Claims to be from the White Rose killer. Says it's urgent. Miles and Carter froze. Another direct taunt? Carter hurried to take the call, while Miles felt the tension coil like a spring in his chest. The killer was taunting them again, dancing on the edge of exposure. But what new horror would they unleash next? And who would pay the ultimate price for the secrets so carefully concealed? End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. The Killer's Taunt. Detective Carter picked up the receiver in a small side office, signaling for Miles to join her. She pressed the phone against her ear. "This is Detective Carter." A low, distorted voice crackled over the line, sending a chill through the cramped room. "Have you found the truth yet, Detective?" Each word was measured, dripping with mocking confidence. "Or do you still stumble in the dark?" Miles moved closer, straining to catch every syllable. Carter remained composed. "Who is this?" A short, mirthless laugh. "Ha! You know exactly who I am. The rose? The messages? You read my warnings, but you ignored them, just like the guilty ignore their sins." Carter forced her voice steady. "Why are you doing this? If you have proof of wrongdoing, come forward. Murder isn't justice." "Justice?" The voice scoffed. "Don't speak of justice when Larking's empire thrived on deceit. Each victim had a part to play. Each refused to confess. And so they paid." Miles grabbed a pen, scribbling notes. "Male? Distorted tone? Possibly using a device?" Carter tried to keep the caller talking. "What about Annabelle Larking? She was innocent." "Innocent?" the voice hissed. "No one connected to that empire is innocent. She discovered the darkness within her own family and did nothing. Silence is complicity." There was a beat of silence. Then the voice returned. "I'll give you one chance to stop another death. Visit the waterfront park at midnight tonight. There, you'll find the next piece of this puzzle. If you're clever enough, you might save a life." A pause. "Or fail again." The line went dead. Carter exhaled shakily, setting the phone down. "They want us at the waterfront park at midnight. Another message, another staged clue, or maybe a trap." Miles nodded grimly. "We have to go. We can't risk ignoring it." The clock ticked toward midnight as Carter, Miles, and a small team of plainclothes officers gathered near a waterfront park known for its scenic view of the harbor. Street lamps cast orange cones of light on the walkway, and a few late-night strollers ambled by, oblivious to the tension gripping the investigators. Carter had arranged for backup at discrete intervals. An unmarked car idling at one corner, two detectives posed as couple on a nearby bench. Miles and Carter walked the path, scanning every shadow, every rustle in the bushes. "What exactly are we looking for?" Carter whispered. "A note? Another rose?" Miles shrugged. "The killer said there'd be a clue, or possibly a hostage. Let's stay alert." They reached a small pier jutting into the water. The reflection of distant city lights glimmered on the waves. A metal bench stood at the pier's end. Carefully, they approached, gun holstered but ready. Sure enough, a single white rose lay on the bench. Next to it, a folded piece of paper. Carter raised the flashlight, illuminating the note's bold scroll. "Confess your part, or the next rose is yours. 2 a.m., Pier 9. She cursed under her breath. Another location, just 2 hours from now. This psycho's leading us on a goose chase. Miles' heart pounded. We can't ignore it. Let's get a team to Pier 9. By 1:30 a.m., the officers regrouped, driving through deserted streets to reach Pier 9, a quiet, run-down stretch near the shipping docks. The air carried a pungent mix of salt and diesel. Cargo containers towered in haphazard rows, forming a labyrinth. Darkness pressed in from all sides, broken only by sporadic floodlights. Carter signaled everyone to split up, calming the area in pairs. Miles ventured with Carter down a narrow aisle between stacked containers, the sound of their footsteps muffled on the oil-stained concrete. Somewhere, a metal chain clanked in the wind. A stray cat yowled in the distance. Every sense in Miles' body was on alert. Suddenly, Carter gripped his arm, pointing to a faint glow around a corner. They inched forward, rounding the corner to see a makeshift table set up under a flickering overhead lamp. On the table lay a tape recorder and a single white rose. Next to it was a Polaroid photograph. Carter picked it up with gloved fingers, gasping at the image. Cynthia Marshall, bound and gagged, her eyes wide with terror. Miles felt a jolt of fear. They had Cynthia. Carter pushed the play button on the tape recorder. A hiss of static, then the same distorted voice. You're close, detective, but still too late. Miss Marshall uncovered truths that demand a final confession. I'll give her 1 hour to renounce her complicity in spreading Larkin's lies, or she dies. If you want to save her, uncover the root of these sins. Find the hidden ledger. Only then will you see who truly pulls the strings. The recording clicked off. Miles exchanged a stricken look with Carter. Cynthia was in mortal danger, and the only clue was a cryptic reference to a hidden ledger. Carter radioed the rest of the team, instructing them to search the containers, the warehouses, anywhere a hostage might be held. But the killer had a head start. This elaborate cat and mouse scheme had been planned, each step orchestrated. Miles' mind raced. The hidden ledger had to be the real smoking gun behind Larkin Marine's alleged corruption, possibly in Oliver Crane's possession or somewhere else in the shipping empire's labyrinth of documents. We need to confront Crane, he said, urgency thick in his voice. Or even Larkin himself. One of them knows exactly what this ledger is. Carter nodded. We're running out of time. They sprinted back to the vehicles, hearts hammering. The night had turned from a grim pursuit into a desperate rescue mission. A single hour. That's all they had to save Cynthia's life. And somewhere in the city, the White Rose murderer hovered like a specter, ready to claim another victim in their twisted quest for confession. If Miles and Carter failed, Cynthia Marshall's inquisitive spark would be extinguished forever. End of chapter 8. So the suspense is thickening now. We're getting into chapter 9 and getting closer and closer to hopefully reveal who the killer is and what will happen with Cynthia Marshall. Chapter 9, Revelations. Barging into Oliver Crane's upscale row house at 2 in the morning would normally require a warrant and a hell of a justification. But with a woman's life on the line, Captain Reese authorized an emergency search. Carter and Miles arrived at the ornate door, battered it with the butt of a flashlight, and shouted for Crane to open up. Moments later, a bleary-eyed bathrobe-clad Crane appeared, spluttering with indignation. What is the meaning of this? Miles stepped inside, ignoring Crane's protests. We have a credible threat that a woman's been kidnapped. The killer says there's a hidden ledger proving corporate crimes. We think you know where it is. Crane's face paled, but he quickly tried to mask it with anger. This is an outrage. You can't just force your way in. Carter cut him off, brandishing her badge. We can, under emergent circumstances. Where's the ledger, Crane? He shook his head vehemently. I have no idea. Do you think I'd keep incriminating documents at my home? Miles noticed Crane's trembling hands. Fear? Guilt? Hard to say. We know Gregory Fuchs and Margaret Dyer discovered financial irregularities tied to your department. Did you bury the evidence? Crane's breathing turned ragged. I manage hundreds of accounts. I can't possibly know every detail. Impatient, Carter signaled to officers who began searching the premises. Crane tried to protest, but Captain Reese arrived, eyes blazing and threatening him with obstruction. After a tense few minutes, an officer emerged from an upstairs study carrying a slim black binder with the Larking Marine logo. We found this hidden behind some books, the officer said, handing it over. Carter opened it, scanning pages crammed with columns of shipping numbers, payments, and cryptic notations. The entries were out of sync with official statements referencing coded transactions. It appeared to be a record of illicit dealings, possibly money laundering, contraband, shipments. Carter looked up, adrenaline spiking. Is this the ledger the killer mentioned? Crane wiped a sheen of sweat from his forehead. If that's what you think, you're mistaken. But his voice shook. Miles flipped through the pages, seeing references to special cargo number 347 and discretion fees, names of employees, Margaret Dyer, Gregory Fuchs, even Jason Kim's father, sprinkled the margins. And at the bottom of multiple pages, approved by E.L. Miles' blood ran cold. E.L. Edward Larking? This ledger implicated the CEO himself. You lied to us, Carter said, her voice trembling with fury. And people are dying for it. Crane slumped into a chair, burying his face in his hands. I was under orders. Larkin demanded we keep 2 sets of books. He said it was for tax reasons. But as time went on, it was smuggling, bribes. Anyone who questioned it was paid off or let go. Miles' mind reeled. So the empire was truly built on corruption. The killer wanted to expose his secrets, but who? What about Annabelle? He asked. Did she know? Crane nodded miserably. She stumbled on some suspicious accounts. She threatened to confront her father. I tried to dissuade her, but she was determined. Then she turned up dead. Carter's jaw clenched. So the big question remains, who's the killer? Who's picking off everyone with knowledge of these crimes? Crane's eyes darted up, a new wave of fear. You think it's Edward Larking? That he's eliminating loose ends? Miles considered that possibility. But something about the messages, confess thy sins, you cannot hide forever, suggested a moral crusader, not just a CEO cleaning house. Could Larkin be that twisted? Or is it someone seeking revenge against him, using the victims as a statement? Just then, Carter's phone rang. She answered, putting it on a speaker. It was the White Rose murderer's distorted voice again. Time's almost up, detective. Have you found the ledger? Will you make Larkin confess? Carter glanced at Miles, then hissed into the phone. We have your ledger. Where's Cynthia Marshall? A chuckle. She's close to the heart of Larkin's corruption now. If you want to save her, bring the ledger to the old Larkin's warehouse on Pier 16. Come alone, or she dies. Before Carter could respond, the line clicked dead. She cursed softly, turning to Miles. It's a trap, but we have no choice. Reese swore under his breath. We can't send you in there without backup. Miles agreed. We'll set up a perimeter, but I'll go in. Let the killer think we're following instructions. We need to distract him long enough to rescue Cynthia. Carter nodded, tension etched in her features. We have to move now. They turned to see Crane, trembling in his chair. If Larkin was behind this, or if it was some other figure seeking retribution, they found out soon enough. With the incriminating ledger in hand, the final confrontation loomed at Pier 16. And with Cynthia's life on the line, there was no room for error. End of chapter 9. So let's get ready for the last and final chapter, chapter 10. Final confession. Midnight had long passed when Miles arrived at Pier 16. The black binder clutched under his arm like forbidden contraband. The old Larkin warehouse stood ominous at the water's edge, a hulking shadow in the moonlight. Detective Carter and a SWAT team gathered in stealth around the perimeter, waiting for Miles' signal. He stepped through a broken doorway into a cavernous space littered with disused pallets and rusting metal scaffolding. Every footstep echoed, stirring faint dust motes in the moonlit gloom. "I'm here," he called out, voice echoing. A distorted voice replied from somewhere in the darkness. "Place the ledger on the ground. Step back." Miles hesitated, scanning for movement. Then he set the ledger on the concrete floor, stepping away slowly. "Where's Cynthia Marshall?" A shuffling sound, and then a dim overhead light flickered on. Beneath it, Cynthia sat bound to a chair, her eyes wide with fear, gag in her mouth. Standing behind her was a figure cloaked in shadow, holding a long knife. The glint of the blade caught the light. A chilling hush settled over the vast room. "You brought the ledger?" the killer said. The voice still sounded distorted, but up close, Miles could catch a hint of its natural timbre. Perhaps male, perhaps female. Hard to tell. "You're smarter than the others." Miles raised his hands, staying calm. "This ends here. You made your point. Larkin's empire is corrupt. Put the knife down, and no one else has to die." A snarl tore from the killer's throat. No one listened when Larkin's greed ruined lives. They looked away while he smuggled contraband, bribed officials. Even his own daughter refused to blow the whistle. They were all complicit. The killer placed the knife against Cynthia's throat, and she whimpered. "One more confession is needed." Miles' heart hammered. Whose confession? Edward Larkin's? A hollow laugh. "He'll never confess, but the world will know once I release the ledger. They'll see the entire circle of guilt. The white rose stands for purity, a symbol that truth can be cleansed only through penance." Slowly, so as not to startle the killer, Miles stepped closer. He needed to keep them talking. Annabelle was going to expose her father, wasn't she? A tense silence. Then, in a moment of mania, the killer spit out. She hesitated too long. She had a chance, but she faltered, letting more shipments go through. "I gave her her rose so she'd never forget her silence." The voice shook with righteous fury. "But I couldn't let her live." Miles carefully slid another step forward. He caught the faint silhouette of the killer's face. A hood or a mask obscured the features. "Who are you?" Before the killer could answer, a sudden commotion erupted behind them. Detective Carter and two SWAT officers stormed in, guns raised. "Drop the weapon!" Carter yelled, her voice echoing of the cavernous walls. The killer whirled, knife still pressed to Cynthia's throat. "Stay back!" A mania-laced threat. "I'll kill her." Carter and the SWAT team froze in a tense standoff, triggers half pulled. Miles, arms raised, took a bold risk. "Listen to me," he said softly, meeting the killer's gaze, or where it should be, under the hood. "You've succeeded in exposing the truth. That ledger is all evidence the world needs to see. Don't add another life to your list." For a flicker of a second, the killer hesitated. The rage that fueled them wavered, replaced by confusion or desperation. In that instant, Cynthia seized her chance. She jerked her head sideways, away from the blade, biting hard on the gag to free her mouth. A startled cry escaped her. The killer reacted, fury spiking. "No!" They raised their knife high, poised to strike. Time seemed to slow. Carter shouted for them to stop. Miles lunged forward, driving his shoulder into the killer's arm. The blade clattered to the ground, echoing in the steel rafters. A tangle of limbs ensued, Miles and the killer crashing to the floor, rolling. A gloved fist struck Miles' jaw, sending stars across his vision, but he held on, grappling the killer's wrists. Carter rushed in, helping subdue the suspect as the SWAT officers pried them apart. Finally, the killer lay pinned, gasping for breath, mask askew. Carter tore it off, revealing Rosalind Vega, the poised VP from Larking Marine. Her face contorted with anguish, eyes wild. She spat blood from a split lip, glaring at them with raw hate. "You?" Carter breathed, stunned. "You killed them all?" Vega's expression twisted. "I watched Larking smuggle arms, poison communities, ruin honest people's lives. I confronted them. Margaret, Fuchs, all of them. They didn't care. Nobody confessed. Nobody tried to stop it. So I forced their confessions in blood." Cynthia, freed from her bonds, clung to Miles with tears in her eyes. Carter read Miranda rights as Officer cuffed Vega. She raved about cleansing sins and exposing evil. The ledger was her proof, the murderers her justice. At last, the White Rose murderer was unmasked. Outside, the crisp pre-dawn air greeted them. Cynthia was taken to an ambulance for a checkup. Though she insisted she was fine aside from bruises, Carter secured the ledger as evidence, while SWAT escorted a raving Rosalind Vega away in cuffs. Captain Reese arrived, disabled but relieved. "We got her. Good work, Harrington." Carter. Miles nodded, too exhausted for celebration. The city's nightmare had ended, but the fallout would be massive. Arrests, court proceedings, the downfall of Larking's empire. Perhaps even Larking himself would face charges for illegal smuggling and conspiracy. He walked over to Cynthia, who sat on the ambulance tailgate, still trembling. "You okay?" She exhaled shakily. "I will be. Thanks for, well, everything." She glanced at the chaos of flashing lights. "I owe you a proper story. If you'll give me an interview." Miles managed a faint smile. "Let's see how the dust settles. Maybe we can tell the city the truth, without fueling more panic." Cynthia nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I'll try to keep it factual. No sensationalism." Detective Carter appeared, her face a mixture of relief and residual shock. "We did it," she said softly. "But at what cost?" Miles stared across the water, the first glimmers of sunrise reflecting on the rippled surface. So many lives lost, all because of a hidden ledger and one woman's twisted quest for vengeance. He breathed in the cold morning air, trying to find solace in the stillness. Perhaps in time, the city would heal. Baltimore would move on, albeit scarred by the memory of white roses and cryptic messages. As for Miles Harrington, he felt the familiar awareness that came with solving yet another case rooted in tragedy. Soon, he returned to New York, to the subtle progress with his father and sister. But their story, too, could wait. For now, he was simply grateful that the White Rose murderer was in custody, and that Cynthia Marshall was alive to see another day, ready to report the truth that might finally bring Larking's corruption to light. And in that newsday dawn, as the sun cast its first rays over the battered old pier, Miles allowed himself a quiet moment of triumph, tempered by the knowledge that true justice was rarely so clean, and the scars of this investigation would remain long after the headlines faded. The end. So let us know what you think about this form of reading, more in-person reading, storytelling of our Miles Harrington murder mysteries, and put your comments in the comment fields below. And it would be really good if you could like and subscribe. That will help the channel to grow, and we will continue to have different types of reading and different types of publishing our Miles Harrington books and other books as well. So until the next one, take care, and we will be doing more reading of Miles Harrington in the weeks to come. Bye.